Now we are moving forward to keynote speeches. Our first invited guests, ilk davetli konuşmacımız Romanya'dan Cuza Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Laura Diaconu Maxim. Hello, Miss Maxim, how are you, Professor?
Hello, good morning again. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm truly honored to be present here and to be invited here at this prestigious event. And
we are very happy to see you here also.
Thank you so much. I hope the presentation I'm going to do today, you'll find it interesting, and I hope you have questions. I'm waiting for your questions and for anything that is not clear, and maybe subsequent discussions.
Okay, today the title of your presentation will be Challenges and Perspectives in Sustainable Development, the Romanian Case. Bugün Sayın Hocamızın sunumunun başlığı sürdürülebilir kalkınmada zorluklar ve bakış açısı, perspektif şeklinde Romanya üzerinden bize bir sunum yapacak hocamız. Şimdi sunumla ilgili sorular da bekliyorum dedi sizden. Burada bulunmaktan çok mutluyum dedi. Yes, Professor, you can start your presentation now.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
Okay.
Yes, can you see it?
Just a second. Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, so, just a second to see if I can, yeah, perfect. Yeah,
yes.
I think it's okay, right? No.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you once again. The paper I'm going to present you today is about challenges and perspectives in sustainable development, the Romanian case. The sustainable development concept has a wide approach in the literature, most of the studies concluding that this notion tries to combine the growing concerns about a range of environmental issues with some socioeconomic aspects. The most commonly used descriptions of sustainable development refers to the fact that growth must be both inclusive and environmentally sound in order to reduce poverty and build shared prosperity for today's population and to continue to meet the needs of future generations. Considering this definition offered by World Bank, we may argue that growth, in order to be sustainable and to ensure long-term prosperity, needs to be doubled by economic development, social inclusion, and environmental awareness. Economic development goes far beyond the objective of increased average income, and it includes several non-economic dimensions, such as adequate public institutions, strong social and cultural values, high levels of education and health. So the human capital theories offered consistent support for the idea that the education is an essential factor for increasing labor productivity of a person and consequently for ensuring a higher living standard. Therefore, the improvements in the level of education and living standard are considered prerequisites for the economic development. The sustainability of growth has also been analyzed in close relation with the environment, the researchers noticing that the growing economic activity requires larger inputs of energy and materials and generate larger quantities of waste byproducts. It is assumed that the depletion of natural resources, the accumulation of waste, and the increasing pollution will overwhelm the carrying capacity of the biosphere, leading to the degradation of the environmental quality and to the decline in the living standards. Moreover, the degradation of the resources will put the economic activity itself at risk, and the pollution will negatively impact the quantity and quality of labor. Starting from the Kuznets curve model, some economists consider that the fastest road to environmental improvement is along the economic growth path because the increased incomes will raise the demand for improved environmental quality. However, this will happen only when the growth is doubled by economic development. The long-term well-being of a society depends not only on the material prosperity, but also on the nature and quality of the human relationships within it, namely the social capital. As it argued by many analysts, the higher the social cohesion, the better the individual's quality of life will be. It was found a strong relationship between social inclusion, social cohesion, and social capital, being argued that a higher level of social inclusion will lead to a better social cohesion, which in turn will positively influence the relationships between individuals, namely the social capital. So the topic of social inclusion started to be analyzed only since 2000, when the researchers considered that it was related to the phenomena such as poverty, unemployment, low educational attainment, and income inequalities. In a report presented at the Stockholm Summit in 2001, the European Commission formulated a set of 7 indicators that measure the social inclusions. This distribution of income, share of population below the poverty line before and after social transfer, persistency of poverty, population in jobless households, regional disparities, low education, and long-term unemployment rate. Why are these important? Because these indicators represented a major step towards the development of the European Union's social policy. In the beginning of the 21st century, the sustainable development issues represented a major concern for the European Union. In 2005, the European Council has adopted the guiding principle of the EU Sustainable Development Strategy. The transition of the Central and Eastern European states to a market economy requires great sacrifices, especially in the first 10 years. This transition process was accompanied by economic depression, which led to a significant decline in both gross domestic product and living standards, as well as to an increase in the unemployment, particularly in the beginning of the 90s. However, by the end of the 20th century, this economy stabilized, the inflation decreased, and new industrial mechanisms and relations developed. Meanwhile, the social awareness toward the environmental problem gradually evolved. In the beginning of 2000s, the implementation of the sustainable development requirements became a new challenge for the European from Central and Eastern part countries, especially in the context of their European Union adhesion aim. Even if significant improvements have been registered, the economic and social progresses between these states and also within them mainly remain uneven. Moreover, the global financial crisis and subsequently the COVID crisis revealed the fragility of these progresses, accelerating the environmental degradation and increasing the costs for the society. Romania has broadly followed the same trend as most of the Eastern European states after the collapse of communist regime in 1989. In 2008, Romania implemented the National Sustainable Development Strategy 2013, 2020, 2030 with the major aim of gradually closing the gap between it and other European Union states in terms of the main sustainable development aspects. According to this document, Romania's strategic objectives in the medium and long run refer to the fact that the country has to reach the average level of the main indicators of sustainable development registered by the European Union states. In 2015, Romania joined the Summit of Sustainable Development, aimed at adopting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This agenda includes 17 sustainable development goals related to eradication of extreme poverty, combating inequality and injustice, and protecting the planet until 2030. The present paper actually analyzes the economic, social, and environmental climate of Romania between 2000 and 2020 in order to identify the main factors that challenge the sustainable development and formulate possible solutions. The research methods used are both qualitative and quantitative. And the documentary research led to the development of 3 hypotheses, which were subsequently tested using several models based on statistical analysis of secondary data. So regarding the economic, social, and environmental climate in Romania, we can say that the road towards sustainability poses challenges for how to balance ecological and environmental concerns with human well-being and economic development. Several studies investigating the realities of the sustainable development in Romania, especially after 2000, Based on this analysis of the indicators listed in the EU Sustainable Development Strategy, they concluded that even if sustainable development is not an easy objective to reach in Romania, there are resources which can lead to a long-term development if they are used rationally. The Romanian economy has the potential to support the sustainable development if it proves that it is rigorous, responsible, and coherent in promoted public policies. The analysis of the economic growth revealed that Romania has a high economic growth potential. As we can see in this figure, Romania recorded a strong dynamic of the real GDP per inhabitant from 2.6% in 2000 until 8.8% in 2007, which was approximately 3 times higher than the EU average. However, the global crisis led to an economic contraction. In 2008, the level of the GDP per capita in Romania was among the lowest in the European Union, representing only 44% of the EU average. In 2009 and 2010, the GDP per capita growth continued the negative trend. Although weakened by the effects of the economic crisis, the real GDP per capita began to increase after 2010, following an upward trend. This contributed to the Romanian economic recovery. According to the official data in 2017, Romania registered the highest real GDP growth among the EU states, with a growth rate of almost 8% compared to the EU average of 2.2%. Despite that, starting with 2018, the GDP per capita declined again, being aggravated by the COVID pandemic context. Yet, the statistics for the last year are optimistic, the real GDP per capita growth being of 6.7%. The favorable situation of the economic growth in Romania between 2008 and 2010-2016, and of course, during last year, it is not a consequence of the labor productivity's improvements, but it is rather owed to the large consumption. This conclusion is supported by the analysts of the evolution of this the analysis of the evolution of these indicators. As we can see here, during 2000-2020, the growth rate of labor productivity per employed person recorded a sinuous evolution from 3.2% in 2000 to almost 10% in 2021. The highest level was registered in 2002 and the lowest one, minus 5.2% in 2009, when the consequences of the global crisis started to be felt in Romania. After that, the rate of the labor productivity started to improve, but at a very slow pace, and it has never reached the 2002 level. The evolution of the labor productivity in Romania in the context of the 2008-2009 crisis and COVID crisis and during the afterwards recessions is not surprising. The economic literature underlying the fact that the economic and financial and also global health downturns have a short-run effect on growth rate of labor productivity and a long-run effect on its level. Contrary-wise, in the case of the average consumption expenditure per capita, according to the National Institute of Statistics of Romania, Romania recorded sustained increasing levels between 2000-2008 and 2010-2018. It is surprising that the consumption has not fallen much, not even during the two crises, except from short periods, 2009-2010 and 2019-2020. Despite the effects of the economic downturn that followed the 2008-2009 crisis, the living standards have continued to rise, the real GDP growing by 4.5% in 2015 and 5.4% in 2016, compared to the EU average of 1.6%. Actually, it is considered that between 2012 and 2016, Romania's economic growth was mainly driven by the household's consumption. Recent studies showed that in 2021 and even in the first half of 2022, the consumption expenditure have significantly increased in Romania, despite the inflation that is felt more and more acutely with each passing day. The global crisis from the 21st century led to new global debates among scholars, academics, policymakers, and entrepreneurs on the sustainable development topic. In this context, it was analyzed the sustainable development of Romania and its moral values and principles. It was investigated the connection between economic growth and the stock of human capital. It was found a positive relationship between human capital index and economic growth in the EU countries. However, despite this positive relationship registered at the level of the member states, Romania had the lowest human capital index in the European Union and also the lowest coefficient for education pillar. This result was mainly a consequence of the low score registered of the quantity of education and on the availability of qualified employees. From the point of view of education, which is considered a component of the standard of living, the National Sustainable Development Strategy states that the radical improvement and diversification of the opportunities offered by the Romanian education and training system are the major objective with strategic importance, and meanwhile the basic preconditions for an effective implementation of principle of sustainable development on medium and long term. However, as a developing country, Romania needs a high number of workers with an average level of education, able to adapt to the continuous changes of the labor market and to find suitable jobs inside the country. Yet, instead of encouraging the type of education that would bring the highest benefits for the country, namely the secondary level, Romania focuses on the development of the tertiary education, which does not generate a surplus of national income because of the reduced exploitation of their knowledge inside the country. The explanation of this fact comes from the economic theory, which states that in the developing countries, those tempted to migrate will accumulate a higher level of education. Regarding the social dimension of sustainable development, Romania strengthens the unemployment rate, which has been lower than the EU average since 2007. The rise in the unemployment was relatively modest after the global crisis from 2008 and 2009 and in the COVID context. These statistics were positively influenced by the emigration, which increased in the beginning of 2000s and then again between 2014 and 2019, and this, of course, shrank the labor force. One of the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Even if since 1957, the EU Treaty promotes equal pay for equal work as one of the EU's founding principles, 60 years later, the gender pay gap still exists, and it varies considerably across the member states. In Romania, the wage gap between men and women varied over time from 16% in 2002 to 5.2% in 2019, which is much lower than the EU average of 16.2%. According to a report of World Bank, Romania has made significant progresses in improving the gender equity over the last 15 years, but it still confronts with serious challenges in addressing the vulnerabilities of women as social group. In terms of risk poverty or social exclusion, in 2008, 1 year after the EU adhesion, Romania was among the member states with the highest proportion of the population at risk of income poverty. A positive aspect is the fact that 10 years later, the percentage decreased by almost 7 percentage points. However, the evolution of another social indicator, people at risk of income poverty after social transfers, is discouraging. If in 2000 the value of this indicator was 17%, in 2019 its level increased at 26.3%. This value placed Romania on the second place in EU after Latvia. Sustainable development cannot be achieved without tackling the environmental challenges such as pollution or climate change. Romania must promote policies to raise the energetic efficiency in parallel with increasing the weight of the energy obtained from renewed sources in order to ensure the energy independence. The electricity generated from renewable sources has grown from 28.9% in 2000 to 31.4% in 2008, when it was 2 times higher than the EU average. Share electricity from renewable sources in the total electric power continued to increase after 2008, so that in 2020 it has reached 43.8%. Investigating the dynamic relationship between income per capita, energy consumption, and dioxide emissions in the case of Romania, it was noticed that the long-run relationship between economic growth, energy consumption, and energy pollutants. Therefore, in order to enhance sustainability, it is necessary to reduce the energy intensity of human well-being, meaning the amount of energy used per unit of human well-being. From the point of view of the greenhouse gas emissions, the statistics show that the Romanian authorities have been preoccupied to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions even since 1990s. Therefore, as we can see here, between 1990 and 2020, the greenhouse gas emissions have more than halved, reaching in 2020 the value of 71.4 tons of dioxide equivalents. This value represented 2.6% of the EU total greenhouse gas emissions, placing Romania below other Central and Eastern European states, such as Czech Republic and Poland, but well above Bulgaria. So, as mentioned before, the aim of the present paper is to identify the main factors that contribute to sustainable development in Romania and formulate possible solutions for its challenges. So, taking into account the literature on sustainable development, we assume that the sustainable development of Romania is based on several major pillars. The labor productivity, determined to a certain extent by the education level, and the living standard, both of them influencing the economic prosperity, the level of the social inclusion, and the quality of the environment. Therefore, our research hypotheses are, first of all, raising the level of education leads to improvements in labor productivity, which together with a high living standard will support the economic growth. Improving the level of social inclusion by reducing the poverty, the unemployment, and the wage gaps between men and women will have positive impact on growth. And the third hypothesis, the emphasis on renewable energy and decreasing the waste and the pollution will sustain the long-term economic growth. In order to test these hypotheses, we use the data obtained from several sources. Most of the indicators are based on data collected from the Sustainable Development Indicators in Romania database. 2 indicators were compiled using information from the World Bank Open Data database. So here you can see the indicators that were used in the analysis. Regarding the data analysis, several linear regression models, both simple and multiple, have been developed in order to test those hypotheses. These were based on the least square methods. The indicators from the previous table were used as either dependent or independent variables in the developed econometric models. In terms of the results for the first hypothesis, we have considered the per capita GDP growth rate as an indicator for economic growth, while the household final consumption expenditure per capita was used to assess the living standard. Finally, labor productivity was estimated using the growth rate of labor productivity per employed person indicator. Therefore, we have developed the first linear regression model in order to test the first hypothesis. So the model, this first model, we found it significant. And it explains almost 87% of the variance in the GDP per capita growth rate. The results from the second table indicate that both predictors are statistically significant, with the household final consumption expenditure per capita having a slightly higher beta value than the growth rate of labor productivity per employed person. So the first model was followed by a simple linear regression analysis performed with the purpose of testing the relationship between labor productivity and education. The indicator taken into account for education was the enrollment in secondary education growth rate. The explanation for using this indicator can be found in human capital theories. Many studies prove that In order to support economic growth of a country, the improvements in the level of education according to the development stage of the economy are more important than the amount of the resources allocated for education. This means that a developing country, as it is Romania, should focus more on achieving high levels of enrollment and graduation from the secondary education cycle. The Model 1B explains about a quarter of the variance in labor productivity, and it is significant. This indicates a positive medium to strong relationship between the two variables. However, there are obviously various other factors that can potentially influence the labor productivity. So the results from the Model 1A and 1B offer support for confirming the first hypothesis. As it was expected, the consumer's expenditure and the labor productivity play a significant role in stimulating the rate of the economic growth in Romania. A higher labor productivity, determined among others by an increased level of education, will raise a country's prosperity. According to one of the most used methods of measuring the GDP, a higher consumer spending will positively influence the economic growth. The positive relationship between the secondary education and the labor productivity suggests, once again, the fact that Romania, as an emerging economy, needs to invest more in this level of education. Only by doing this, the public financial resources will be optimally allocated according to the criteria of the social efficiency and of the current and future needs of the economy. For Romania, the secondary education is very important because it leads to the creation of a medium-trained workforce capable of increasing the productivity and of using the technology. To test the second hypothesis, we used as independent variables all the indicators offered by the National Institute of Statistics for measuring the social inclusion, namely at risk of poverty rate after social transfer, population in jobless households, and gender pay gap. This resulted in the following multiple regression model. In the case of this model, none of the independent variables make a significant contribution to explaining the variance in the GDP per capita growth rate. All p-values are larger than 0.05. This is also reflected in the small and not significant R-squared value of 9.87%. The fact that at-risk poverty rate after social transfers and the population in jobless households do not influence the rate of economic growth in Romania may have two explanations. First of all, the income protection for the working age population that does not have a job has become less adequate, and secondly, the social policies focused on redistribution have become less pro-poor. Despite the consistent literature, which argues that the impact of gender wage inequality on growth is negative, the results of our study show that there is no significant influence of the gender pay gap on the rate of economic growth in Romania. This may be partially explained through the fact that the wage gap in Romania is low compared to the EU average, and it has constantly decreased during the last years. Therefore, even if in Romania the women might be in some cases discriminated against, this does not discourage them from entering the labor market as it happens in the developed states. The results obtained from testing the second model led to the rejection of the second hypothesis. The influence of the environment on the economic growth, as described in the third hypothesis, was assessed with three additional simple linear regression models. The three indicators used were the share of electricity from renewable sources in the total electric power, total greenhouse gas emissions for estimating pollution, and the total industrial waste generated. Given the potential relationship between the environmental indicators, the simple linear regression approach was preferred to a multiple one in order to avoid possible multicollinearity issues. The results for the linear regression model from the first of the three show that the share of electricity from renewable sources does not impact the GDP per capita growth rate. The small r square value of 0.0116 is not significant. As far as the greenhouse gases emissions are concerned, approximately 1/3 of the variance in the GDP per capita growth rate can be explained by this indicator. Model 3b indicates a significant relationship between the two variables. The positive impact of the greenhouse gas emissions on the GDP per capita growth rate in Romania can be explained through the help of the Kuznets curve, according to which in the developing countries, while the level of economic development increases, the pollution also rises. This relationship will change into a negative one after the moment in which Romania will become a developed country and will start to invest more in non-polluting industries. Moreover, in that moment, it is very likely that the electricity production from renewable sources would influence the economic growth because the development encourages the usage of more renewable energy. For the moment, Romania is in the so-called neutrality states category, which involves the absence of a causal relationship between energy consumption from renewable sources and the GDP per capita growth rate. Industrial waste is also a significant predictor for the development for the dependent variable. The last from the three models, the model 3C, accounts for 39.51% of the variance of GDP per capita growth rate, with an F-statistic p-value of 0.029. The relationship between the two variables is negative. A lower amount of waste generated by the economic activity positively influenced Romania's GDP per capita growth rate, which means that Romania needs to continue reducing the waste in order to support the sustainable development. This result is in line with the findings of a study conducted by the European Commission on the case of Sweden, which stresses that the reduction of waste quantity by 2030 will stimulate economic growth of the country. Considering all these aspects, we may argue that in order to enhance the long-term development, Romania has to focus on the development of the renewable energy and on decreasing the waste and pollution. Given the results from these last regression models, we can conclude that the third hypothesis is only partially confirmed. So the results of our research are in line with the ideas provided by the literature, and they offer support for confirming the first hypothesis and for partially confirming the third hypothesis. The second hypothesis was not supported by the findings and therefore was rejected. However, we cannot state that increasing the level of social inclusion in Romania will not lead to a higher economic growth, as our second model was based only on the indicators provided by the National Institute of Statistics for the social inclusion. The particularities of Romania's situation would also require the analysis of other social variables. According to our findings, in order to enhance the long-term growth, Romania, as an emerging economy, needs a larger number of workers with a medium general level of education, capable of adapting to a permanent change of the labor market and to find the best insertion within the national boundaries. Therefore, higher investments in the secondary education will raise the labor productivity, and together with an increased consumption will lead to higher rates of economic growth. For enhancing the social inclusion, Romania should properly adjust the policies meant to help the working age population that is out of job, not only by stimulating the investments and the aggregate demand, but also by implementing active requalification measures through vocational training. This purpose can also be achieved through the already mentioned solution, the increase in the investments in the secondary education. Due to the fact that education plays a pivotal role in the earnings of a person, this measure may also have a positive impact on reducing the poverty rate. Meanwhile, considering the fact that in Romania the percentage of women with at least secondary education is lower than the percentage of men, and that the labor force participation rate is considerably inferior in the case of women than in the case of men, we may argue that by increasing the level of knowledge and abilities through secondary and vocational education, the wage pay gap will diminish. According to previous studies, a higher social inclusion will support the sustainable development. From the environmental perspective, we conclude that if the future Romanian economic evolution will lead to a reduction of the greenhouse gas emission and waste, and to an increase in the electricity production from renewable sources, as the country will continue to develop, these may represent an important step towards sustainable growth. Our results have shown that, for the moment, a high level of pollution generated by the greenhouse gas emissions is associated with the increase in the Romanian economic growth, and that renewable energy has no impact on the growth rate of the country. However, we explain that these results will change as Romania continues its path towards development. In conclusion, in order to sustain the economic development, Romania needs to increase its human capital stock, especially the one related to the secondary education, to reduce pollution and waste, and to raise the level of social inclusion. This last aspect could be achieved through adequate policies and active requalification measures meant to reduce unemployment, poverty, and wage inequalities. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm eager to answer your questions if you have. Thank you.
Profesör Maxim, thank you very much. Profesör Maxim'e çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Sorusu olan var mı? Any questions? Actually, I have one question.
Yes, please.
Professor